So if you don't know what Until Dawn is, it's a PlayStation exclusive horror game that sort of falls into the subgenre of interactive movie games, like Heavy Rain or Detroit Become Human for example. So they're basically just games where you make choices during a narrative and those choices affect events later on. And Until Dawn is definitely up there as one of my favourite of these types of games. The game is about 8 teens, who don't look anywhere close to their teens, going back to a winter lodge on the Blackwood Mountain. After a year prior, one of the teens, Joshua's 2 sisters, disappeared at the same location. This was after the group played a cruel prank on one of them. In the present, madness ensues and the 8 characters have to survive until dawn, with you making choices that will determine life or death for them. It's a great game and I really recommend you check it out if you want, but this video isn't to talk about the entire game as a whole, but instead 2 of its 8 characters, Matt Taylor and Jessica Riley. I think these 2 characters might be some of my favourite of the cast, but unfortunately they both kind of get done dirty by the game's story. But before we talk about that, I think it would be wise to actually talk about Matt and Jessica themselves for a little bit, and kind of go into their characters a little bit, starting with Jessica. I just want to say really quickly though, I don't think I'm really good at analysing characters and stuff, so I'm sorry if I make any incorrect points or judgments regarding some characters. So yeah, with that said, let's move on. So, Jessica. She's a very interesting character in my opinion. I think she's meant to be like the stereotypical blonde bitchy girl of the group, but honestly, in most cases it seems like she will only be bitchy to you if you're bitchy to her first. Honestly, she really seems like she would be a fun person to be around, if you're on her good side at least. She is the girlfriend of the character Mike, and I honestly really like them together. They spend a lot of the early parts of the story with each other, and I honestly really love all their dialogue and interactions. But as for their actual core relationship, from what we see in the game, it seems like they don't really share that many of the same interests with one another, which kind of makes it seem like their relationship is purely based off looks and physical attraction. Whilst I don't think that's actually true, I do feel like they should have wrote in some stuff to make their relationship feel like it's not just based on physical attraction. Something I find kind of interesting is that at one point early in the story, Jessica can actually kind of open up to Mike about her insecurities, which even though they don't really go too much into it beyond that single conversation, it at least adds a small new layer to Jessica's character. Another important figure to mention when talking about Jessica is her best friend Emily. Well, I guess based on their interactions they have in the story, I guess a more fitting term is former best friend.
Oh my god, that is so gross. Are you trying to swallow his face hole? No one wants in on your territory, honey.
Excuse me? Did you say something?
Oh, did you not hear me? Was your sluttiness too loud?
Sounds like someone's bitter she didn't make the cut.
Yeah, it's all a big cattle call with that dreamboat. Congrats, you're top cow.
Cuts real deep calling Miss Homecoming a cow.
You see, in the past, Emily and Jessica were, I guess you could say, besties, given the way Emily and Jessica communicate in the prologue and how Jessica refers to Emily in the prologue.
Hannah's been making the moves on him. I'm just looking out for my girl Em.
But as you can see by their interaction in the present, that is clearly no longer the case for them. Jess was actually the main mastermind behind the prank they pulled on Hannah, Josh's sister, a year before. And given how the prank resulted, i.e. both of Josh's sisters going missing, it probably tore Emily and Jess's friendship apart. Another reason to why they hate each other now is probably because Emily is actually Mike, Jessica's current boyfriend's ex-girlfriend. Mike had recently dumped her and then got with Jessica instead. So if it wasn't the prank that destroyed their friendship, it was definitely that, as their whole mind-numbing argument at the beginning of the game shows. So yeah, overall for this segment, I quite like Jessica. She's a pretty funny character and I quite like her personality, as well as her relationship and all of her interactions with Mike. So yeah, moving on to the next character we're going to discuss in this video, Matt. I'm guessing Matt's meant to be the jock type of character in the game. He has the whole jock stereotypical type look with the jacket and all that, which literally has his first initial on it. You know, just in case you forgot who you were talking to. And he's described throughout the game as being a meathead or having meat for brains and stuff like that. But honestly, I don't really think that's true. To be fair, you can have him make some pretty stupid decisions that will cost him a lot. But at most, he can just be a little bit naive. To be honest, it isn't even him being naive, he just trusts his friends. Which kinda sucks because his friends can take advantage of that and use it to deceive him, as we will see in a little bit. Matt just seems like he's a nice and likeable guy, and he doesn't deserve anything that can happen to him throughout this game. Okay, here we go. Matt is Emily, who I mentioned before, his new boyfriend, and honestly she does not deserve him at all. Matt seems like he's really trying his best to be a good partner towards Emily, but as for her, she's mostly just very unjustifiably rude and bitchy to him. There are points where she does show some love and kindness towards Matt, but that's honestly very rare throughout the time we see them together in the story. She just treats Matt like a doormat most of the time. At a later point in the story, during a scene where Matt and Emily are on a collapsing radio tower, we'll get to that, Matt can actually stand up to Emily and tell her about the way he feels about the way she's treating him. I don't know why, that was kind of a tongue twister for me. Emily eventually apologises to Matt and claims that she will treat him better in the future, but it could be possible she's just saying that to get out of the situation that she's currently in. The situation being her dangling off of an upside down radio tower in a cavern, and as she sees it, Matt is the only way she can possibly get out there alive. So if that's said, she would probably just say anything if it means her getting out of there alive. Another thing regarding Matt and Emily's relationship, there's a point in chapter 1 where, as you're playing as the character Ashley, you spot through a telescope Mike and Emily, exes mind you, getting a little too close with each other than exes probably should. Matt appears, and as Ashley you have the choice to either let Matt look through the telescope to see what's happening or to hide it from him. If you let him see what's going on, he confronts Mike about it a little later on. The confrontation can either end peacefully or end with them both getting physical, which if that does happen, Mike and Matt's relationship goes all the way down on the status menu, and it's basically irreparable because Mike and Matt never see each other again in the story after this. But during the whole confrontation, Mike explains himself to Matt and said that him and Em were just hugging out and talking since they hadn't seen each other in a while. But I mean, I don't know, Emily was pretty secretive about going up to meet up with Mike. If it was like Mike said, she wouldn't have needed to be secretive about it at all. And about the whole interaction itself, I don't know, they looked like they were getting pretty close to each other. Much closer than you would need to be if you're just simply catching up with someone. By the way, something I found really weird about this scene. Even though to everyone else, all of this stuff that Matt is saying is just accusations towards Mike, I'm surprised Jess doesn't get involved in all of this. Or at least ask Mike about it later on. Because I mean, she's his girlfriend after all. If I were her, I would at least dig a little bit deeper into it. But who knows, maybe she just really trusts Mike. But anyway, yeah, moving on. If Matt knows about the whole Mike and Em thing, he also has the option to bring it up to Emily during that whole radio tower sequence I mentioned earlier. Once again, we will get into full detail of that in a bit. And after some pushing about it, Emily just ends up saying,
I was confused.
So you fucked him!
Please. Matt, I'm sorry.
It's not really clear if Mike and Emily were being romantic in that scene, or if it was just some sort of misunderstanding. But if they were, that's awful on both Emily and Mike's part, since they both currently have new partners. Also, in comparison to the other couples in the game, Matt and Emily's whole relationship just feels quite underdeveloped. Like, in a lot of their scenes, they just feel like they're simply acquainted with one another. No intimate relation or anything like that. Like, if they didn't make it clear in their character bios at the very beginning of the game that they were in a relationship, you literally would not be able to tell. Okay, that's obviously a joke, you would clearly be able to tell. But overall, it just feels like they're in a kind of non-existent relationship. The reason it feels this way is because there was actually an entire segment that helps build the relationship that was cut out of the base game. It's meant to take place in chapter 2, and it has Matt and Emily searching for a lost bag. This whole segment gives Matt and Emily's relationship a lot more development, and it actually makes Emily way more likeable as a partner to Matt, in comparison to how she's seen in the normal base game at least. This segment is technically still in the game and it's playable, however it was actually integrated as a pre-order bonus. Okay, I get not wanting to pad out the early game too much, but Matt and Emily's relationship was in desperate need of this kind of development, so I really think this segment should have been kept in the base game. Now I kinda want to get into the main part of this video, which is how Matt and Jessica are treated by the game's plot. Let's start by talking about what happens with Jess in the game's story. At an early point in the game, Mike and Jess go to a nearby guest cabin on the mountain, you know, to get some private time away from everyone else at the lodge. After being chased by what they think was an angry bear, they both make it to the guest cabin safely, albeit Jess is missing her phone. After getting comfortable, Jess feels as if they're both being watched. Soon afterward, her missing phone flies through the bathroom window. Jessica, thinking it's their friends from the lodge coming out there to mess with them, goes outside the cabin to the porch to scold them. After closing the door, she surprisingly and very quickly gets yanked out the window and into the night by an unknown entity. We later find out this is a creature called the Wendigo that's part of a curse that resides on the mountain. But this video isn't really to go into and dissect the Wendigo, so yeah, let's just move on. After Jess gets yanked out of the window, Mike chases after her. This culminates in a sequence that involves a lot of QTEs and choices on shortcuts to take. At the end of this scene, Mike sees Jessica being dragged into an old looking building. Mike descends into the basement of the building and comes upon an elevator shaft. Depending on the choices you made during the entire chase, like hitting quick time events or choosing shortcuts, it determines the outcome of this scene. If you fail a bunch of the quick time events during this scene and choose a lot of the longer routes to go, Mike will arrive in the basement too late and the Wendigo will have already killed Jessica. Her body falls from the elevator shaft and then a few seconds later the entire elevator collapses, making her body fall down the shaft and into the darkness. In this specific route, the only time Jessica is seen again is in chapter 10. Sam and Mike find her body and decapitated head inside the Wendigo's lair, along with all the other characters who could be killed up until that point. However, if Mike made all of the correct choices during the chase, like hitting the large majority of the quick time events and choosing all the correct shortcuts, Mike can make it to the basement before the Wendigos kill Jessica. When he gets to the elevator shaft in this route, he finds a a bloody and seriously messed up, but still alive Jessica laying on the elevator floor. But like if she were dead, when Mike goes to reach for her, the elevator collapses once again and falls into the darkness. And after this, the story just proceeds as normal for now. Moving on to Matt's side. A little bit after the events with Jessica happened, both Matt and Emily, after discovering Josh has been killed by the psycho, they venture out to go and find help. However, they find that the cable car, the only safe way off the mountain, is stalled and the key needed to activate it is missing. So I guess they have to find help a different way. Luckily for them, they find out from a map in the cable car station that a radio tower is close by. So Emily suggests using that to try and call for help, assuming there is a radio inside. Matt can choose to either agree or disagree with this plan. No matter what he chooses here, he is forced to go anyway. But it does affect something pretty stupid later on. You'll see what I mean. After getting out of the cable car station, Matt and Emily come across a cliff edge. And whilst on the cliff edge, they end up getting surrounded and trapped by a bunch of deer. Whilst passively making their way through them, for some reason, Matt has the choice to kill one of them with an axe. Yeah, that can only end well. If he does decide to do this, the deer drive him over the edge of the cliff, but Matt grabs onto a lower part so he doesn't fall immediately. But whilst Matt is trying to climb back up to the top, if you fail any of the quick time events, he does fall and dies when he hits the bottom. If Matt does die like this, Emily can actually find his shoe in the mines later on. But in the case where Matt doesn't die in this scene, Matt and Emily both proceed and make it to the radio tower. Whilst there, you play as Emily and you have to turn on the power box in order to use the radio. But during this part, you can actually find an emergency flare box, with the flare gun inside obviously. Emily either has the option to give the flare gun to Matt or hold on to it herself. If she does choose to hold on to it herself, she either has the option to shoot it or stow it away, which can help her later on. But if you give it to Matt, depending on whether or not he agreed with the plan to go to the tower in the first place, he either shoots up into the air or holds on to it himself. To be more specific, if he agrees with the plan, he shoots it into the air, and if he disagreed with it, he stows it. And given what this flare gun can do for Matt in a little bit, it's so stupid that you have to make a specific set of choices to get him to keep it. After activating the power, Emily successfully calls for help on the radio. But right afterwards, the Wendigo from outside breaks the support beams of the radio tower, causing it to fall into what is basically an open cavern. This leads to the scene I mentioned earlier where Emily is trapped on the radio tower, and Matt either has the opportunity to stand up to her bitchiness, or question her about her and Mike. But after a conversation, Matt is given the choice to either try and save Emily or jump to safety. Jumping to safety secures Matt's survival of this scene, but after he jumps, the entire radio tower along with Emily falls. But on the other hand, if you try and save Emily, she ends up falling anyway, and then the radio tower comes soon after. But this time Matt's on it. So whilst it's collapsing, he quickly jumps and lands on a lower level of the mine. Whilst in this lower level, he gets attacked and dragged by the Wendigo. And if he has the flare gun, he can actually shoot and ward it off. However, if he doesn't have the flare gun, the Wendigo ends up killing him. But no matter how this chapter results for Matt, Emily is revealed to have actually survived in the next chapter. What Matt chooses whilst on the radio tower basically determines how she views him for the rest of the story. That being, if he jumped to safety, Emily would hate him for it. And if he tried to save her, she would be worried about him. You know, I find it so annoying that in order for Matt to survive after saving Emily, he has to have the flare gun, which he can only get if he makes a specific set of choices beforehand. Choices that you wouldn't even know could possibly lead to it without hindsight. Also, something I want to mention, I have no clue if this was a glitch or not, but during one of the playthroughs I done to get footage for this video, I tried to save Emily and survived as Matt, and Emily was angry at Matt in the police interviews at the end, even though I literally tried to save her.
You bringing in Meat Brain next? Gonna kick him around a bit for me?
I'm sorry?
Meat Brain, Mr. Muscle Brawn, Matt the Incredible Sulk.
Is there something we need to know?
Oh, no, nothing important except, you know, how he basically left me to die up on a freaking tumbling tower like a world-class douche nozzle?
I don't know if this was a glitch. I know Emily does have dialogue for being concerned for Matt at the end even if he lives. Maybe she was still mad at him because I didn't side with her during the argument with Jessica at the beginning. But if so, that is so stupid. Like, who cares who your boyfriend sided with in an argument like 9 hours ago? He risked his life to try and save yours. It doesn't matter if he didn't succeed or not, he still tried. You literally cannot be mad at someone for that. That whole thing just gives me another reason to hate Emily. Anyway, moving on. After these chapters, Matt and Jess's story presence and contribution just grinds to a halt. They're basically just gone. We don't see or play as them at all. But in chapter 9, we get this short scene kind of out of nowhere, where it shows Jessica waking up at the bottom of the elevator shaft. And then in chapter 10, the final chapter of the game. In the latter half, we randomly cut to playing as Matt, who I guess has just been wandering around the caves for like 3.5 hours. Him and Jessica meet up, and they both continue down the tunnels together. Oh, and if Jessica's dead before this, Matt doesn't meet up with anyone, obviously. And if Matt is dead, you play for this sequence as Jessica. And obviously if they're both dead, you don't play for the sequence at all. Whilst going through the tunnels, they encounter the Wendigo. And during this sequence, you get this really weird decision to abandon Jessica. Like, I don't know, it just doesn't seem like the type of thing Matt would do as we've come to know him. Granted, he can jump to safety on the radio tower, but I don't really think his plan there was to abandon Emily. The tower just happened to fall when he jumped. It was probably a selfish decision to make, but I think his plan was to help her from that ledge after he jumped. But with this Jessica situation, it's just straight up like abandon her. Anyway, this whole scene either ends with them escaping the mines or dying. If they successfully escape, they see the lodge in the distance, and that's it. It cuts back to Sam for the finale part, and you literally never see either of them again until the police interview is in the credits. But it's weird because like it shows the lodge in the distance, kind of implying that, you know, they're gonna go there, but then they just don't. Because this sequence kind of just feels like it comes out of nowhere and is put just randomly near the end of the chapter. It sure feels like they forgot about Matt and Jessica when writing the plot, and then when they were done writing chapter 10, they realised they forgot about them and then just wrote in a finale for them real quick. I don't know how true this is, but apparently Jessica was originally written to die no matter what, but later in development they made it so that she could survive. If they made this change pretty far into writing the story, and they didn't want to make any revisions, her treatment by the plot makes sense. But even if all that's true, it still doesn't explain why Matt's treated this way by the plot. I couldn't find anything about him being originally intended to die or anything, which just makes it weird as to why he gets this treatment too. To be honest, even though I like Jessica and wish she'd done more in the plot, I'm actually fine with her being treated this way by the plot. Because if done right, I actually kind of like the trope of, oh, a character who was presumed dead is actually still alive thing. I'm just kind of annoyed that they've done a similar thing with Matt, you know, without the whole presumed dead part. Honestly, an idea I kind of like and something I wish they'd done was if this whole sequence of Matt and Jessica took place in chapter 8, either before or after the sequence that you play as Emily in. And then Jessica and Matt arrive back at the lodge around the same time Emily does, and they remain part of the group for the entire rest of the story. If this happened, this would honestly make for some really interesting interactions. You know, Matt and Emily's conversation after the whole tower thing, which would probably change quite a lot depending on what Matt done on the tower. Mike's reaction to Jessica being alive would be interesting. Oh, and it would be interesting to see Matt's reaction to Mike potentially shooting Emily in the basement. And above all of this potentially interesting stuff, Matt and Jessica would also likely be involved with the lodge finale, which would be quite cool. But by the way it is for both of them in the actual game, it just feels kinda like a waste. Jessica and Matt probably could have done more in the story, but they just never got the chance to. However, there are apparently rumours that Until Dawn is getting some kind of remake at some point in the future. I heard that this rumoured remake apparently includes some rewrites to the game's plot, which means, if this remake is real, then Matt and Jessica have a chance to get more done with their characters than they did in this main game. But I guess we just have to wait and see if this remake is real and gets announced at some point. But until then, I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll see you later. Have a nice day.